Yo, what's going on guys? It's G-Miners here, and in this video I'm going over all of the weapons, the full builds, the loadout setups, and then also the team comp and damage setups that we're bringing into the day one raid this Friday. This is going to be the full weapon setup that I probably load into the raid with on day one. That being said, looking at our kinetic slot weapons, I'm starting with Eggers just because it's extremely good when you get a single kill. Everything nearby freezes. So if ads are pushing you in something like lanterns, it should be extremely useful. With Osteo, this is just one of the best ad clear SMGs in the game. It's also really good for the strand rotation as well. We do also have Witherhoard, which is fantastic for supplemental boss damage, but also really good for ad clear in the earlier encounters. And then I also have Riptide as a kinetic fusion or a stasis fusion with chill clip in this case, so that I can hopefully free some tankier enemies if they're pushing me, like knights or even wizards. SMG wise, submission is one of the best, if not the best, in the kinetic slot with something like overflow and frenzy. I do have heritage. This is really good, especially if a knight is pushing you, just for some really good supplemental damage or just burst damage to tanky enemies. And then same thing goes with conditional finality. This is really good, especially for multiple champion types and then just anything that's tanky. The ammo economy is also super good with this weapon. After that, I do have Succession. Succession is really good just if you need a sniper and you don't want to reload it. Reconstruction Vorpal is amazing. And then I do also have Arbalest in cases where I just want to use this for supplemental damage or I want to use it against champions. It's been leaked that anti-barrier champions are going to be in the raid as the main champion type, if not the only champion type, so this should be pretty useful in that case. On my Titan, I have the rest of the weapons. If you are on Titan with like Synthos, you might want a 1-2 punch shotgun. Nightwatch is probably the best overall scout rifle that you can take into the raid. I really like Rufus's Fury as an auto. It's really good with demo and frenzy, and we do have anti-barrier auto this season, so that's really useful. If you ever need to swap to a primary, Touch of Malice is probably just the easiest go-to right out of the gate to swap and get better damage off for your team. Izanagi's Burden, I don't have this on my main right away because I'll probably be using this mostly during boss phases for rotations. So I just have this on a secondary character that I can pull from. Even though blinding GLs are nowhere near meta in my opinion, it's still nice to have one, especially with something like auto-loading holster, so you can shoot a group of ads, blind them, take them out, have it reload for you. Then after that, New Pacific Epitaph is the only Waveframe GL that we have in the kinetic slot. So I do have this if I want my ad clear in kinetic for whatever reason. And then lastly, I tend to like Thorn as another primary. I doubt I'll honestly use this over something like Osteo, but I have this just in case. As far as energy weapons go, Forbearance is still arguably the best ad clear weapon in the entire game, even with the double special nerf. Plus with special ammo, you can generate a ton of ammo for these weapons with ammo finishers, so this is pretty easy to still manage. I do have Cartesian Coordinate. I know people say Aramite is really good. That's only something that should be used on your galley or your tractor player for just spam. If you're using a fusion in a rotation, absolutely make sure you're using a rapid fire frame. Cartesian pairs really well with surges on something like Apex, so that's really useful. I have Sunshot. This is one of the best exotic primary ad clear weapons in the entire game as well. And then for primaries, I have Unforgiven, which I really like to run with Demo Frenzy. Funnel Web is equally as good. Any 900 RPM SMG that you take in with good perks is solid. And then for scouts, I like to run Tarnished Metal. It is a 200 RPM, but it has rapid hit and explosive payload, so it feels really good. On top of this, I do have Deafening Whisper. This has autoloading led from gold. It isn't the best roll, but I do like having autoloading in certain cases where I want to just shoot it, clear a bunch of ads, and then not have to reload. So I do really like this. And you can also get a similar roll with not Deafening Whisper, with Explosive Personality. After that, I have Ariana's Vow in case I do need to use this against anti-barrier champions. And then I have Divinity and then Risk Runner. Divinity I won't be using, but you absolutely want to make sure you bring this into the raid, especially if you're whiffing shots, missing rockets, you just want easier times hitting crits. This still applies a 15% debuff. It makes it way better for your overall damage to just be consistent across many damage phases. So I highly recommend teams using this as well. And then for Risk Runner, we will likely be taking a lot of arc damage from like wizards and knights and boomers and things like that. So Risk Runner could be great if you find you need that extra damage resistance and the ad clear becomes effective for you and your team. Then once again, on my Titan, just as some secondary weapons I can find really quickly to pull if I need it. I have Fourth Horseman for burst damage against probably not bosses, but majors, mini bosses, champions, things like that. Merciless is great, especially if you're spamming this after you dump rockets. Path of Least Resistance and then also Tarnished Metal are my shoot to loot options. I have one in the primary ammo type and then obviously in special ammo, depending on what I end up running in this slot. That way I can swap and have matching ammo types. Iterative Loop with Volt Shot, just if one person runs this, it's good to have. Boost your damage by a little bit, even with the Volt Shot nerf. Nessus Ablation is really good. You could also use a Philo if you want a slug shotgun in this slot. This has reconstruction, so you don't have to reload. Philo has auto-loading holster if you manage to get a god roll, so you also really don't need to reload either. And then lastly, I have Truth Teller in case I do manage to do triple weapon swaps for damage against the boss. And then Explosive Personality, you don't want Genesis on this. You probably want to go with something like Auto-Loading Holster and Frenzy, which is another easy craftable auto-loading Waveframe GL you can use instead of that Deafening Whisper I showed. When it comes to heavies, make sure you have an Apex with Reconstruction and Bipod. I always have Xenophage just for non-boss encounters. I love the way this plays. An Eager-Edged Sword just for movement or ad clear. Swords are still really good for clearing ads. I do have a Cataphract. You don't really need a GL, but I did manage to get the God roll, so I do have this. Most importantly, a Recon Bait and Switch Apex for ad clear. Commemoration with Reconstruction is really strong. Lament for burst damage or close range damage. And then obviously a linear just in case we have sustained damage phases. I won't be using these myself, but make sure somebody has Tractor Cannon for a 30% debuff, Wolf Packs to buff your rockets. I've heard Levy's Breath is really good. I still need to get Caddy done for this. For burst damage, Parasite is extremely strong. Also for burst damage, Code Comfort with Envious Bait and Switch is fantastic. For close range damage, the Legend of Acarius is also really good, and for total damage output, surprisingly. For burst damage, Grand Overture can also be pretty good. I do also tend to have Anarchy ready to go just in case. And then also, if a boss has a very weird hitbox or something, Wordcliff can often melt weird bosses, so I have that as well. As far as team composition goes, in case anybody is making last minute changes or they want recommendations for team comps, my advice is always to have people play on what they're most comfortable. Team comp, for 99% of the cases, does not matter. The only exception, I think, to that rule is having at least 2 or more Warlocks. Warlocks are really good for a longer damage phase that exceeds 30 seconds. You're going to want 2 wells, or if there is a short interval between damage phases and you can't get your well back for just having 1 Warlock being your only well lock, you're going to want to have people alternating. So I do recommend having 2 Warlocks. Also, maybe bring in a Hunter as well so that you do have another option for a 30% debuff through something like Tether. But other than that, general rule of thumb, I think is just 2 or more Warlocks. After that, I think you should be fine, and you could probably even not follow that rule and get away with a clear as well. Next up, I want to go over all the builds that our Warlocks, Hunters, and Titans are using. There will be links in the description to videos so you guys can check out each build that I mention in further detail. On Warlock, we're mainly using Sunbracers on Solar. I doubt we'll probably hop off of this too much during the raid race. It's always just a good default build to run. With Sunbracers, I'll have 2 different versions, one with Ick Dash, one with Heat Rises. After that, for any survivability-based encounter, I love the Nothing Manacles Void build on Warlock. You're just spamming Scatter Grenades, you have Devour, pretty much infinite uptime on most of your abilities. This is really good and makes it very easy to survive most encounters, but it is a bit of a selfish build. After that, I just have a Fallen Sunstar Arc build. The only reason for this is if we need Arc Souls for damage, which I highly doubt we will. After that, I do have a Verity's Brow Healing Grenade build. You can easily swap this out over to a Fusion Grenade if you don't need the healing as well. And then lastly, for Warlocks, I do have a Strand setup. This is just used for DPS, the Broodweaver with like Thread of Ascent, Thread of Generation, so that you can spam rockets and get a supplemental damage super off when you have a bunch of Warlocks on your team. When it comes to the Hunter builds, you're going to see that we have a Solar damage setup ready to go. This is with Blade Barrage, Trio Shot Golden Gun, and Star Eater Scales, whatever you prefer to run on Solar. The exact same thing happens on Arc. You want a Gathering Storm build ready to go just in case as well. You can really pick whatever one of these 2 you prefer. After that, we have a Whirling Maelstrom build ready to go, just in case we need to use this and the Tangle Final Blows to generate a ton of heavy ammo, as I covered in my recent video. We also do have a Malfeasance and then a Lucky Pants build ready to go. Highly recommend you bring that into the day 1 for supplemental damage and damage rotations. And then obviously a Void build like so. You can run this with your Falcon's Hauberk. We think that Omnioculus for Team Invis is going to be really good in the Lanterns encounter. And then as always, you can just run this on good old Aeons for your team. Lastly, when it comes to Titan, the Strand build setup that is really effective right now is with Banner of War, Generation, Warding, and Fury. This is extremely good with Synthoceps. You can also run a really effective Synthocept build when on Solar with your Infinite Hammer and then Soul Invictus and Roaring Flames for extra damage. Also, on top of this, you can have an Arc Coil build ready to go, just like I have here, and you can swap this for Curus for damage. Don't really recommend doing that. It's probably better to not risk your life to get a T-Crash off. And then finally, as always, we have a Void Heart of Inmost Light build like I have right here. This is still really effective for ability spam, and with Echo of Starvation, really good survivability. When it comes to loadouts, you want to make these as easy to use and then also effective during day 1 races. For that reason, in boss encounters, when I'm using a build, I tend to run 2 setups. First is the general play for like add clear, stuff like that. My mods are going to be different here and a bit more useful overall. And then as soon as damage starts, I'm going to hot swap to a second build where everything stays the same, and I'm just really swapping to 3x solar surges and then maybe like an elemental time dilation to make damage much more manageable. You'll notice that I have 3 random open loadout slots, and the reason for this is on the case that I'm not doing DPS with the Strand build, I like to just keep these open so I can overwrite them with whatever build I might be using so that I can quickly save something, add surges, and just copy this build over here and make that small mod change. And then the third and final thing you're going to notice is I have this last build right here. With this, I do have max reserves, and then I do also have a scavenger mod for like any situation I'm using Apex Predator for damage. The only other thing you'd want to add to this build is a shoot to loot weapon. If I'm on a special like Forbearance, I would hot swap to a trace. If I'm running like a primary like funnel web, I would hot swap to a scout with shoot to loot and then probably explosive payload. That's the only other change. So basically, you're doing add clear like this. Damage starts and you hot swap to this to maximize your damage. As soon as damage ends, you hot swap, shoot to loot a bunch of bricks to get max reserves and use your scavenger, fill up on heavy ammo, and then you can immediately swap back and then do it all over again. Finally, I wanted to go over some pretty useful information when it comes to dealing damage against bosses, and then also some general rule of thumb stuff for what you should be using. Starting with the cool information that can potentially help you out. With Monochromatic Maestro on Solar, considering Apex is meta and then so is Cartesian Coordinate right now, you can apply a Solar ability, and those Scorched Stacks will constantly extend the Monochromatic Maestro buff until it eventually wears off. So with a single Solar ability at the start of a damage phase, you can get around 15 to maybe 20 seconds of Monochromatic buffing your solar weapons by 10%, which is super useful. Second to that is the perk Rapid Fire Ranger is able to infinitely extend a 30% debuff. Even though this only applies 15% itself, if you apply a 30% and then hit this before that 30% wears off, it will keep extending the 30% infinitely. The only exception is it does not work with Tether, it works with Tractor, it works with Felwinter's Helm, and that's it. So make sure you're using one of those if you try to pair it with Rapid Fire Ranger. Lastly, for rule of thumb damage against bosses, if you're whiffing stuff, like you're whiffing your procs for bait and switch, you're whiffing multiple rockets, just go with bipod. It's going to mitigate your damage loss. In cases where you are optimal, always run reconstruction and bait and switch though. The other thing to note with this is you can use this effectively with Izzy, or probably just for ease of use, I would recommend a Cartesian Coordinate, which is also solar and matches with your surges. Anything after 30 seconds is when something like a linear should also start to become more optimal, because after 30 seconds, you're running out of rockets. All you can really do is spam extra special if you have it, and your damage should fall off, where linears should be able to compete at those longer time intervals. Other than that, for like a 10 to 15 second damage phase, I would recommend just spamming bait and switch Envious Assassin Code Comfort, obviously with surges. And then for close range damage phases, I would recommend Legend of Acurius or potentially even the Lament if this is tracking and working effectively. That is pretty much everything that you guys should need to know for going into day one for Crota's End this Friday. A lot of this is overkill too. Find whatever works for you and your team. Run that, make sure it's consistent, and in my opinion, consistency is always better than trying to be optimal, because if a mistake happens when you're trying to be optimal, it can likely throw a run, whereas if you're just consistent with something that might be a little bit worse, and you're 3 or 4 phasing a boss, I think it's a better way to play the game. Lastly, I will also be streaming my team's run this Friday at Reset. If you guys want to pop into the stream earlier and ask any questions, get any clarifications, feel free to do that. And I'm live most nights over on Twitch if you guys want to ask questions over there. As always, have a good one, guys. Peace.